As you know, I'm spending several weeks on introduction to the Kabbalah, introduction to the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah. This will go up on the YouTube channel. It will go up into my podcast. For those who would like to study the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah, therefore, you can listen to these talks and you won't need all of the introductory material. So one thing that's propelling my talks is the quote from Gershom Scholem in his book, The Kabbalah. It's on page 45. It's a red book. It contains all of his essays in the Encyclopedia Judaica on the Kabbalah. And on that page, he points out that the Kabbalah in its historical dimension can be understood as the intersection of Jewish Gnosticism and Jewish Neoplatonism. And therefore, any time we want to study the Kabbalah, according to Gershom Scholem, who is the greatest scholar of Kabbalah who ever lived, it seems we ought to know something of Jewish Gnosticism and Jewish Neoplatonism to understand what the Kabbalah is. So I'm giving a few talks on, first of all, on Gnosticism and Jewish Gnosticism, and then Neoplatonism and Jewish Neoplatonism, and then I'll go on to the origins of the Kabbalah. So last time I wanted to give an introduction to some Gnostic texts. Let me put all this in context. The word gnosis, in Greek it's with a G, has to do with knowledge. Gnosis is a certain kind of knowledge. It's different from episteme, it's different from techne. The Greek language has many, many words for knowledge, but gnosis has a kind of a knowledge that's purely spiritual, purely intellectual, a kind of knowledge that the mind knows. In fact, the Greek words for knowledge predict Immanuel Kant's categories of perception, meaning the mind is already a framework for the kinds of things we can know. Some things we can know through the senses, tactile. Some things we know deductively, for example, mathematics. Some things we know from observation. But there are other truths that we know that we access spiritually and intellectually. So gnosis, with a G, refers to those kinds of truths known. They're also called noetic truths, poetic truths of the mind. So here's what we know about the first mention of the term gnosis. Apparently is from the Bishop of Lyon, Irenaeus, if I have his name right, lived about 180. And Irenaeus was born in Syria, Asia Minor, became a head of the church, we call it the Catholic Church, moved to Rome, and the Christian community in Lyon in France had suffered a catastrophic persecution where all of their leaders had been murdered and the church was highly persecuted. So Irenaeus goes to Lyon to try to build the church back up in France. One thing he finds is there's great, what he called heresy, we would just call diversity. So when you look at the sources of early Christianity, there was no one Christianity. The Nicene Creed of 325 under Emperor Constantine had not yet been produced. So early Christianity was notable for its extreme diversity in points of view. There was no, as it were, orthodox Christianity yet. There was no one view yet. The four Gospels had not been selected yet. By the way, Irenaeus had a role in that. There was no agreement on which exactly of the letters of Paul were actually by Paul. And there were many other Gospels written and in circulation. And many other texts written and in circulation. And there became a movement in the time of Irenaeus to decide that the four Gospels that we have today, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, should be the four Gospels, and the creation of what we might call, in retrospect, a dogmatically correct Christianity. But at the time, it was a choice of one version of Christianity over other versions of Christianity. And by the way, the same thing was happening in Judaism. Whenever people talk about first century Judaism, out of which Christianity was born, scholars like to point out it's much better to say first century Judaisms, because it was very syncretistic. There was no synthesis. It was simply many different religious attitudes and practices existing together at the same time. So Irenaeus noticed that there was one particular divergent view that he called a heresy. In fact, his most famous book is called Against the Heretics. especially heretics named Valentinus, that is a specific way of understanding the world, understanding Christ, understanding the different kinds of texts, understanding the Gospels. And he referred to himself as a Gnostic, meaning a knower. So he claimed to have a kind of knowledge that other people didn't have. Now, Irenaeus, I hope I'm getting all the pronunciations right, he said, well, he's not a knower of anything true, he's a knower of falsehood. So Irenaeus therefore made the distinction between true knowledge, true gnosis, and false gnosis. Now, over time, you didn't have to add true gnosis to dogmatically correct Christianity. It was just dogmatically correct Christianity. All the other versions were called heresies, especially the heresies of what is called gnosis. I'll talk about that in a moment. And his particular object of ire was Valentinus, and you can look all this up. So when you look at the so-called the Gnostic tradition in Christianity, now we're going to go back in a moment and look at what we now can call Jewish Gnosticism, but the term is used a little bit anachronistically because what we call Gnosticism was first applied to Christians, meaning Christians divergent from what became dogmatic Christian thought. It's a vast body of literature, and once they noticed the themes of Christian Gnosticism, they noticed those themes existed in early Judaism, and therefore scholars use the term Gnostics to refer to early Jewish texts and beliefs that were similar in structure to Christian Gnosticism. So some people say the only true Gnostics, as it were Christian. That's historically true, meaning they weren't called Gnostics until the time of the, let's say, the 1st, 2nd century CE. However, if we look at it as a kind of genre, a kind of a phenomenon, clearly it pre-existed what we would call Rabbinic Judaism. So I recommend it to all of you if you want to see a very available and approachable course on early Gnosticism. I found one on Great Courses that we access through Prime Video. I put it in a link to my Shabbat Thought. And I want to just present a few things that really a fantastic, clear teacher pointed out. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Christian Gnosticism, and then we're going to apply that to Jewish Gnosticism. So what are some major features of Gnosticism? First of all, the world as we see it is not the world as it is. There's something else going on in the world. And what's going on in the world is there is a higher source of spirit and truth and light, which the uninitiated person, the person who's not a knower, meaning not a Gnostic, here I'm going to use it in general, not a knower, doesn't know that there's a higher world of light. We live down here in a world of darkness where the truth is not clear. That's one belief. A second belief among the Christian Gnostics was that there is a lower world God, sometimes called the demiurge, that rules the lower world, and that the God of the Hebrew Bible that they called the Old Testament was that God. So some said that the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is not worth studying because it's all the work of the demiurge, the evil God, which probably caused John in the Gospel of John chapter 8 to call the Jewish people the children of Satan, because Jews, of course, believed in the Hebrew Bible. So the Christian Gnostics, as it were, not only did they say this world that we take for granted is actually a kind of an underworld ruled by an evil God, the demiurge, or the God of the Hebrew Bible. Most people don't know this until they have this special knowledge. So there is a rejection of the world as it is for a different world. There was rejection of the Hebrew Bible. And a third thing would be that when you look at Gnostic text, and here's what's fascinating, they clearly know their Hebrew Bible enough to know that there are names like Shem and Noah and Enoch and others, the names of the 12 patriarchs of Adam and Eve, and they write alternative creation stories, very, very complex mythologies, one of which I read last week. And by the way, I brought out one of my many books on this one. It's called the Gnostic Bible. I don't recommend you read this because they become very repetitive. All these Gnostic myths have a very same kind structure, sometimes quite horrific. I mean, they're discussing evil, and when they get down to discussing evil, it is rather disgusting. But they all have the sense of that there was originally a good world of God and the angels. There's a rebel angel, some angel, some divine being that turns against the higher realm, and then creates this lower realm in which we human beings are trapped. Now, the mythologies are strikingly different from each other at the same time that they're strikingly similar to each other. So as I was studying Gnosticism 20, 30, even more years ago, and I began to study these texts, I realized it was a world that in a way it was a shared world that was populated by different versions of this idea. So the world is not as it is. The non-knower does not know about the higher world, the lower world. The Hebrew Bible, the God of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is an evil God, and therefore there's a strong bifurcation between the New Testament and the Old Testament Hebrew Bible. Very, very complex mythologies, and the idea that to be brought into these secret societies, to become a Gnostic, there's an extended period of vetting, a period of initiation, because the person would be given divine secrets. Now, not all of this, by the way, was rooted in biblical texts. Although, if you look at most Gnostic books, they're very biblical. Either the Jewish Gnostic books rooted in the Hebrew Bible in one way or the other, or in the New Testament. There is a tradition called Hermeticism that's based on a syncretism of the Egyptian god Thano, a god of wisdom and knowledge, the Greek god Hermes, which of course is the messenger of the gods, and a somewhat syncretic tradition was created called Hermeticism because of the god Hermes. Now, sometimes when people talk about Hermetic knowledge, they think of it being hermetically sealed. If any of you read one or two of these Gospels and you go to the teachings of Hermeticism, it is not hermetically sealed. Once you basically understand what Gnosticism is, the texts are, while fascinating and divergent, very similar to each other. So this week I went and looked up some texts in the Hermetic tradition. And in the Hermetic tradition, there's a teacher and a student. And what the teacher says is very familiar once you've read 10 or 15 of these Gnostic mythologies. And the student, of course, is astonished by everything that the teacher says. And that's when we think of the Hermetic tradition, that there's a teacher who has all this abstruse and complex knowledge, and the uninitiated student is stunned by the knowledge being given. And therefore, I think we have the idea that the Hermetic tradition is somehow impossibly complex. It's really not. It fits right in with this idea. There's a world of light. There's a world of darkness populated by a complex mythology that are very structurally similar to each other, and that there are the knowers and the non-knowers. Certain rites and purifications for getting into the tradition, and oftentimes combined with a very ascetic lifestyle, which means once you're in the group, once you're in the cult, once you're in the secret society, you have to act. Certain practices are taken on. Now, some of the most famous of these traditions are Manichaeism, that you may have heard of, and Manichaeism. And I was looking for an article that would describe these ideas. So I found one in discussing, and the only reason I'm bringing this up to you is as I was reading the various articles on them, the article on Manichaeism, based on a prophet Mani, who flourished in the 2nd century CE, apparently came from a Jewish Christian family, but is clearly a family of Christian Gnostics and meaning Jewish Gnostics who had adopted Christian Gnosticism, were in the area of Iraq and produced a body of knowledge. Manichaeism, by the way, was almost as widespread as Christianity. It got all throughout Central Asia, all the way into Europe. It was pushed out of European Christianity. It moved all the way to China, into Afghanistan, into India. So if you look up Manichaeism, you'll see it was a dominant world religion that most people have never heard of because it was suppressed by Christianity, then suppressed by Islam, suppressed by Hinduism, suppressed in China, so that it virtually went out of existence. And the reason I'm reading this to you, I'm reading the Wikipedia article simply because it's a great summary of many different kinds of Gnostic teachings. So Manichaeism, a recognition of one God known as Chaya Rabbi. So now you can tell they wrote in Aramaic. Chaya meaning living, Rabbi, the great one. Okay, the great life, the great living God, whose symbol is living water in Aramaic Yardena, from the river Jordan. Hold on a second. That's the article on Mondaism. Not quite as popular, but again, it's in Stark. So I've introduced Manichaeism, but now I'm reading the article on Mondaism. Again, it's just so structurally similar to many different Gnostic groups. Okay, so Mandaeans therefore live near rivers. God is personified and sustaining as the creative force of the universe. The power of light, which is vivifying and personified by Malka de Nahura. Again, very recognizable to anybody who speaks Hebrew. Malka, king, Nahura of light. The immortality of the soul. The fate of the soul is the main concern in the belief of the next life, meaning the soul eventually, it is hoped in Gnostic traditions, as you find in many Western traditions, in Islamic traditions and so forth, that when the body dies, the soul goes up to this higher place. Well, not if you don't have the knowledge. If you don't have the knowledge, you suffer in hell or purgatory. But if you have the knowledge, then you go into the pleroma, the place of God and the angels. Notice how similar this is to traditional Christianity. If you have grace, you return to God, you are returned to the source of life. But if you don't accept Jesus and enjoy the grace of belief, then you burn in hell forever. So this kind of Gnostic, by the way, Jesus never talks about this in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It is talked about in John, a little bit in the letters of Paul, but it's a very strong Gnostic belief. So here, in my opinion, you see where traditional Christianity was very much influenced by what we would call Gnosticism. A supreme formless entity, the expression of which in time and space is creation of spiritual, etheric, meaning an ether, and then material worlds and beings. The cosmos is created by the archetypal man. So here we have a level down from the living God is the primordial human being. In some Gnostic circles, this is the demiurge. Another constant feature is dualism. The dualism starts as mother and father. By the way, you find this in the Kabbalah. The two sides of the Kabbalistic tree of life, one side called Ima, one side called Abba. So you have this in the Kabbalah. Left and right is a dualism. You also find this in the Kabbalah. In fact, the Sitra Achra, the source of evil in the Kabbalah, is oftentimes called the left hand of God, speaking from a right-handed person's perspective. And as a future of dualism, there are counter types that exist in the world. This is called demuta, the Hebrew word demut. Now you can see all of this in the Wikipedia article, and the reason I recommend taking a look at Manichaeism, Mondaism, Hermeticism, if you would like to, you'll see how structurally similar they are, and anything you know about the Kabbalah, you'll begin noticing some differences. For example, a very common Gnostic theme is in aeons. Now, when we think of an aeon, A-E-O-N, we think of an extended period of time. Now, in Gnosticism, aeons were powerful entities that existed between the exalted God, the unknowable God, and the world down here. In the very famous Sefer Yetzirah, by the way, those aeons, now think of an aeon not as an extension in time, but powerful entities that mediate between our world and the divine world. In one of our founding Gnostic texts, Sefer Yetzirah, is numbers. They're called Sfarot, and that is the origin of the Hebrew word for emanations, the Eser Sfirot. So in Sefer Yetzirah, it does not mean what it means in the Kabbalah, but the idea that we live in a number letter created world. So remember, if you in Hebrew, letters are expressions of both language and numbers. Which one reason we have gematria. This is also the Pythagoreans believed in a number mysticism. So Sefer Yetzirah, and we don't know who wrote it, we don't know when it was written. This really is an impenetrable text. The edition that I have has 15 different commentaries. It is not a Kabbalistic text, which unfortunately, R.E.A. Kaplan, who I respect greatly, if you have R.E.A. Kaplan's translation of Sefer Yetzirah, it is simply not a translation of Sefer Yetzirah because he makes the mistake of many people. Since the word sfirot is used, they assume it refers to Kabbalistic sfirot, when in fact it would be better to call them Gnostic aeons, Gnostic kinds of powers. So that takes us over to Jewish Gnosticism. So how is Jewish Gnosticism a bit different from Christian Gnosticism? Well, of course, there's no attack on the God of the Hebrew Bible. In fact, when you look at Jewish Gnostic texts, such as the Book of Enoch, by the way, it seems that John Milton in Paradise Lost relied greatly on the Book of Enoch. When I put them side by side, it's stunning to me. In fact, I'm convinced that John Milton, in writing Paradise Lost, had the Book of Enoch available to him. It was found in Coptic, probably translated into Greek, and then perhaps into English or Latin. And I believe he had the book with him. There are striking similarities. So if you want an interesting introduction to Gnosticism, just read John Milton's Paradise Lost. You have it right in front of you. It's older English, but it's definitely understandable, and a classic in the English language. Well, it seems right out of the Jewish Gnostic tradition. So in the Jewish Gnostic tradition, you don't have the attack on the God of the Hebrew Bible, but you do have the idea that the world down here is not the real world. So when you think of the prophet Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 1, where he sees the throne, Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah sees the throne, there's another world above us. That is the real world of God and the angels. And the world that we live in down here is separated from that world. Now, if you look at the books of Enoch, you do have the idea of the rebel God, that there's a God, angel, who's rebelled against the higher worlds and then come down and made this world evil. If you want to look up the book of Enoch and read about this, and it's rather disgusting. It says that these renegade angels came down and taught all kinds of evil to the human beings, to the point that the human beings were utterly destroying themselves. And the question in the higher worlds was like God in the story of Noah: should God just destroy this thing? So these books have number one, theories of ascent, where people are, Enoch in particular, are ascending from our world into the higher world, a kind of astral projection. And once you get into that higher world, through the 7 worlds, you see the higher world, and the question what to do with the debris of the lower world. When you look at rabbinic traditions of this, and I know I'm getting a little bit detailed here, but you may have heard the terms Merkava mysticism and so forth. This is the mysticism of visionary ascent. This is the mysticism that preceded the Kabbalah. Again, very structured by Jewish Gnosticism. And again, its main feature was it did not hate the God of the Hebrew Bible, and it was in many ways eschatological. Meaning the structure of the world that we have now, it will end one day with the end of times. So that is called the apocalypse, meaning the hidden end of times that only certain teachers knew about. All right, so I'll leave that as far as the structure of Gnosticism. I believe in the world of spirit, light, truth. The Gnostic knew of it. Most people don't. Elaborate mythologies to present the idea. It's hard to get initiated into the group. Once you get initiated into the group, there are ascetic practices. And when you study the body of these texts, many of them have this apocalyptic theme of, as it were, heaven versus the lower world. By the way, Revelation in the New Testament, the Apocryphon, and many, many texts in the Gnostic canon, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, including the Gnostic Gospels discovered in Egypt in 1945. It's a vast tradition. Well, what does that have to do with us? Where do we see this in our world? Well, I want you to think for a moment. The most familiar American forms of Gnosticism, number one, is the Church of Religious Science, Mary Baker Eddy. Now, that may be alarming to you, but when you look at the tenets of the Church of Religious Science, as far as I understand it, our physical bodies are manifestations of our spiritual reality. Therefore, every disease is actually a spiritual disease, which is sometimes, I remember used to read in the headlines, where practitioners of religious science would not take their child to a doctor because the doctor would only be working on the shell of the spirit and not the real disruption, which is a purely spiritual disruption. Now, we don't typically think of the Church of Religious Science as a kind of Gnosticism, but if you understand the structure of Gnosticism, that there's a real spiritual world, and the physical world is not only a fake resemblance, but somehow evil, then you see how the Church of Religious Science, I'm not saying it's Gnostic, but it's kind of a neo-Gnosticism. You can understand it that way. Another American version of Gnosticism is the Nation of Islam. I remember I just happened upon a book on the theology of the Nation of Islam. I was stunned because I remember reading about Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X and Louis Farrakhan. This was actually before Farrakhan. I didn't know there was a theology there. Well, I read the book. There actually is a theology that the first race was black, and some primordial scientist bred the white race to be at war with the black race, and there would be a period of subjugation, and then the black race would overthrow the white race, who are called the blue-eyed devils. Therefore, the Nation of Islam saw itself at war with white supremacy because whites were evil, spawns of the devil, as it were. I'm not making this up. You can go ahead and look up Nation of Islam beliefs. It's hard to get, I think, because in a way the internet is a little bit cleaned up, but you can find, because I found it in a very detailed book. So Nation of Islam is a kind of American Gnosticism. Now, other kinds of Gnosticism during our time, you'll find preserved in some elements of what's called the Theosophical Society. They have a headquarters over on Los Feliz, where they teach what is called the perennial philosophy. Let me talk about that just a bit. Perennial means eternal, always blooming. And there is a belief that there is an original truth, an original kind of philosophic truth that gets embodied in different traditions. And every tradition is really about this truth. By the way, I actually somewhat believe that. I actually believe there is an original, I don't know if there's one that's spread everywhere, but every mystic that I know of who is not a Gnostic, more in the what I'll call the Neoplatonic variety, which I'll get to next week, we all believe something similar, which is kind of striking, because when I talk to a Buddhist mystic, somewhat Neoplatonic, a Christian, a Muslim, I share much more in common with their worldview to, let's say, a Reformed Jew who does not believe in God, not very spiritual, has no sense of a higher truth or a higher power. So I'd rather talk to these people because we share a structure of belief. And again, I'll go into more of this next time. So one aspect of the perennial philosophy is that Gnosticism is just another version of the truth. It's a particularly disturbing version of the truth. It's a very dark version of the truth, but it is one of those versions of the truth. So if you look around us, you'll see actually Gnostic quasi-religions have been created, as it were, under our own eyes. But deeper than that, I see Manichaeism, the idea that the world is divided into forces of light and darkness, Mondaism, Valentinus. I think you know where I'm going with this. I find it in our politics, because I became aware. Now again, I'm not a hater, By the way, I did grow up. I mentioned this before. I did grow up in something of a Gnostic-oriented home. I don't think I've ever put it that way until now. My parents were committed socialist, communists. They were Trotskyites, not Stalinists. But that was the truth. And so who's the enemy? So my father said, Republicans are the enemy. More or less, they're evil. And I was brought up in a home where there was good and evil, and Democrats were good, socialists and communists even better, and all Republicans were evil. And I remember, at my little street in Anaheim, when I would meet a kid who said my parents were Republican, I felt I was in the presence of evil. It really made my skin crawl a little bit. I remember when my parents were discussing the election of 1960, it was if the future of the world depended on whether a force of light or a force of evil would rule our country. Now, I would say my dad, much more than my mom, was committed to this. My mom more or less went for the ride. But my father was adamant about this idea of the worker. I mean, my dad really was a deeply committed socialist to communists, which for him became expressed in union politics. I accepted this without thinking because it was, as it were, the religion of my home. You know what changed it was when we joined a synagogue. When we joined a synagogue, we actually had a faith that superseded this kind of Manichaeism of American politics being divided into forces of light and the forces of darkness, because we had a whole other religion, as it were, that constructed our world. And I just remember we never talked about it anymore. The world was no longer forces of light and forces of darkness. It was moral and immoral. And here are the laws. If people do this kind of stuff, we would call them moral. And if they do other kind of stuff, it's called not moral or unethical. And that became our worldview. And I never really heard any more about this kind of Manichaean idea. And again, I'm only using the term. My father never said he's Manichaean. But as I became more educated in philosophy, I said, wow, I remember hearing very similar to those ideas when I was growing up. Now, then where else do I see it? In political discourse. The other political party is evil. The other political party is a force of darkness. That politician right there, that person is demonic. They're a force of darkness. And therefore, the forces of light have to conquer the forces of darkness. It's one reason why I'm against, as I spoke last night, about this hyperbolic, hugely exaggerated religious discourse, because I'm uncomfortable with Gnosticism. I don't like Manichaeism. By the way, when you look at communism, it has a kind of Manichaeism. Property owners were evil. Everything belongs to the state. So if you were one of those who wanted to hold on to your private property, you were murdered. As you know, Stalin murdered millions and millions of his own people. So forces of light, forces of darkness. The force of light is communism. The force of darkness is capitalism. But I don't think there's any theory of, regulated free trade, which was the animus there. But you see it in their writing. I mean, a true hatred for where somebody just wanted to own a small plot of land suddenly stood for the forces of darkness. Same thing with anti-Semitism. I mean, Hitler and the Nazis saw themselves as the Aryans, the forces of light, at war with the forces of darkness, which were the Jews. So Hitler saw that there was an eternal war between the force of light, force of darkness. The Aryans, and he was borrowing the term from Aryans of Hinduism. The Jews were a lower form of light, the force of darkness. So when the Hitler armies invaded Poland and began rounding up Jews, they were informed that there was a war between the Aryans and the Jews. Try to imagine your local Jewish shtetl, your local Jewish shtetl. There's 150 Jews living in a village, and the Wehrmacht shows up and says, "Oh, we're at war with the Jews." I can imagine the Jews saying, "What war are you talking about? Like, we're not warlike people. We don't have anything to fight you with." From the German perspective, it was a war. And what licensed the SS murdering of millions of Jews? I used to teach Holocaust, so I studied books on the SS. Here's what they were told. It seems heartless to murder Jewish women and children, you're doing future generations a favor so they don't have to kill their descendants. This is actually what they were taught. These are forces of darkness. They're a cancer in the world. We have to destroy all of them. We know this is hard. It doesn't feel morally right, but you are doing a favor for later generations. That is a really severe form of Manichaeism, Mondaism, a very vile form of the worst kinds of Gnosticism. Forces of light, forces of darkness. The forces of darkness must be destroyed because they're dangerous for everybody. So as I look at the history of ideology in the 20th century, especially when I look at communism, National Socialism, and again, I don't see it much in our country having that kind of debate, but I see it in the discourse. Now, I'm very happy that the discourse in our country has not risen to the level of people who see themselves on the side of the forces of light actually engaging in a genocidal campaign against the forces of darkness. The genocide against Native Americans, slaver blacks, was really not a war on the forces of darkness, but just the continuation of what I would call ancient tribalism, where you wipe out the next tribe over because you want their land, and the institution of slavery, which of course inherited from the ancient, from the old world, and the United States being in a way the last great meaning notable practice of an ancient vile institution. So I think when you understand Gnosticism and you understand it deeply, it's a lens by which you can see the world. It's by lens by which you can see 20th century history. It's a lens by which you can see genocide. It's a lens by which you can see ideology. And it's a lens by which you can see yourself. If you see the world in terms of forces of light, forces of darkness, my side is all good, their side is all bad, there's a bit of a Gnostic in you, and not the good kind from Rabbi Finley's perspective. That's something we have to be on guard against. So Jewish Gnosticism had a bit of that, but it was the human race that was fallen, not some particular version of the human race. And again, Jewish Gnosticism was quickly swallowed up by Rabbinic Judaism. There are still some Gnostics there, but these teachings go underground. They percolate now and then, but eventually a form of Jewish Gnosticism becomes the Kabbalah. Now, where do we find this in Kabbalah? So I'll predict where we're headed with this. If you look in the spiritual psychology of the Sefirot, now we're not talking about the nature of God anymore, but if we were actually doing Jewish spiritual psychology on the Kabbalah, you notice another theme of Gnosticism is not only is the world not real, and here we're going to say almost spiritual versus material, put it in modern humanistic terms, I'm not authentic. I want you to think about that idea for a minute. One's authentic self, one's true self. I use that terminology all the time. I use it when I work on myself. That there's, as it were, an authentic aspect of myself, my core being, my soul, that wants to be expressed in my life. In fact, that's another constant theme of Gnosticism, is that the soul is in exile in this world. That's a rabbinic idea, it's a Kabbalistic idea, and it's a Hasidic idea. It's an idea that is shared with ancient Gnosticism. The soul in exile. I spoke about this at Passover when I talked about the exile of the Dibur. Now, that is a Hasidic idea, Kabbalistic idea, but here is where we can see Kabbalah as part of the perennial philosophy. So if the original, again, I don't believe this to be true, that there's an original philosophic idea, but if there is an original philosophic idea that finds itself into many forms, and one form is mysticism, then you could define the Kabbalah as the Jewish participation in the mystical version of the perennial philosophy. I'll say that again. That might be a mouthful if you've ever heard these terms. If there is, as it were, a fount, an origin of everybody who wants to connect themselves with the truth, the light, and the beautiful. I'll say love, justice, truth, and beauty. Let's say there's a fount, and then in every place and every time, there's a different version of how this fount, as it were, goes downstream. So at this level, again, I don't know if this is true, but all religions are basically after the same thing. You may have heard this before. That's a version of what is called the perennial philosophy. By the way, Aldous Huxley wrote a book called The Perennial Philosophy, meaning the eternal philosophy, the constant blooming philosophy. So I remember when I all I knew of the Kabbalah was Gershom Scholem, and then I went back and studied Gnosticism and studied Neoplatonism. I was stunned that Scholem is right. Kabbalah really is an intersection of Jewish Gnosticism and Jewish Neoplatonism, which is based in what I'll call Mediterranean generic Gnosticism, Mediterranean generic Neoplatonism. A Jewish version came into being. It creates the Kabbalah, but the more you read about non-Jewish versions of Gnosticism, and there's a huge variety, and non-Jewish versions of Neoplatonism, they're mutually understandable. They're different dialects of the same language. So when I study Kabbalah, part of me feels I'm studying this ancient heritage that has come down from one religion to another, and the Kabbalah is our version of this ancient heritage. That's one of the ways that I see the Kabbalah. Therefore, if my spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah begins with the idea of I'm in exile, I have an authentic self, it's my inauthentic self that in many ways is governing my life. You can call it ego mind, etc. That's a bit of a Gnostic idea. As you'll see next week, a bit of a Neoplatonic idea as well, that there's a truth and there's a false, that my authentic self is exiled into this world, and I have tremendous work to do for my authenticity, as it were, to rise to the surface. I love that quote by the statement by Santayana that we are residents of this world, but citizens of another. I mean, the first time I read that was probably in high school. That really grabbed me. Because I could feel there's a truth to myself that had to be brought out. It wasn't going to happen by itself. I mean, people can die in a state of exile. And then sometimes I could feel the truth of another human being. And that whatever was ever in between us was not true, that it had to be dismantled. And sometimes when in my counseling practice, what I see is I have to dismantle the untruth between people so people's souls can encounter each other. This is why I was very influenced by Martin Buber. I never would put Martin Buber in this camp, but Martin Buber's idea, there's a world of I-you, ich und du, and a world of I-it, ich und es. And the it world, where everybody is objectified, is clearly a lower world. They're not equal. And the world of ich und du, of true human encounter, is a higher world. So when you start to look at your beliefs, when you start to look at the things that you think are true, I think you're going to find here and there subtle dimensions of Gnosticism, and as you'll see next week, Neoplatonism. That doesn't mean you're a Gnostic in the Valentinian sense, or that Irenaeus of Lyon would hate you or something, but you'll start to see that it is a perennial philosophy, meaning every thoughtful spiritual person, when you start to think about the world, you're going to end up thinking about the world in some of these themes. Now, I don't say that, I don't see it as bad or good. I see it as inevitable. I think this is a structure of human consciousness. This is one of the ways that we see the world. Okay, so then here's the warning. Because this, what I'll call slightly Gnostic, Neoplatonic way of seeing the world, which is a structure of consciousness, meaning I believe there is a world of light and a world of darkness. I believe there's inauthenticity and authenticity. I believe that, as the Kabbalists say, that we live in the Olama de Shikara, the world of lies, and there is a world of truth. I have an instinctive belief in all of that. What I have to remember to do is be humble. Not to assume that the way I have figured it out is necessarily more right than the other person. They might have more truth than I do. Why would I be the gold standard? So that's why I truly believe in a theory of communicative discourse, because when I find someone who disagrees with me, I want to find the truth that they might have. It might be a diamond in the rough, but there's probably something in there. and I'd rather find their truth than call them evil. Now, I don't think this is part of my personality, by the way. I think it's a cultivated point of view ever since I became a spiritual practitioner while I was in high school under the guidance of my teacher, Jack Bishop. So for all of you, when we come into the spiritual psychology of Kabbalah, first of all, I would like you to see the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah as something like an inevitable, necessary aspect of the human condition. It is part of the perennial philosophy, starting with human brokenness, aiming for the world of tikkun, understanding the Gnostic aeons, the power centers. And in the Kabbalah, we see it as chesed and gevurah and so forth. When you look at this language, it is in so many other spiritual mystical traditions that it is not original in the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is the Jewish version of it. So when we are doing Jewish spiritual psychology on the Kabbalah, in my mind, we're doing something that is utterly human and participating in a unique and powerful, and I think salvific kind of human discourse. Salvific meaning it provides a salve to the human condition. So I'll just say three last brief thoughts. For example, let's say I'm doing the spiritual psychology of the Kabbalah, and I come to the aeon or sephira or power or emanation of chesed. And I know there are broken versions, and I know there are whole versions. So this would be love and beneficence. And therefore, if I say that I love someone, that's a double-edged sword. Because if I'm operating in the world of darkness, that's a curse. You know that people, when they say, I love you, it's possessive, it's demanding, it's bossy, meaning everything you do has to make me feel better. There are lower dimensions of chesed. There are higher dimensions of chesed. So what we notice when we study, when I study spiritual psychology of Kabbalah, I try to take each of the sphirot, Gnostically put aeons, different power centers. They exist within us, in which you might call more enlightened versions and less enlightened versions, which means there is love that can be destructive and terrible, and there is love that can actually be transformative. Same thing with gevurah. There are ways of thinking, there are ways of setting boundaries. You can either have good moral judgment or prejudice, meaning prejudging. Well, it's all in the center called gevurah. So when I do Kabbalistic spiritual psychology, I'm looking at all of them, and I'm trying to discover which ones, as it were, are more in the world of light, which ones are more in the world of darkness, which one is more in the world of truth, which one is more in the world of lie. Now, those are parts of what I would call the mystical perennial theology or the perennial mysticism. So my main point today was to share with you that when you lift Gnosticism out of its historical context and extracted it as a kind of an idea, you start to see that it is part of the way that every spiritual, reflective human being sees the world. And therefore, we have to be on the lookout of being careful about ourselves. Because if this is how I see the world, then I could be, much to my consternation, a force of darkness. Maybe the things that I think. So what for me is my main corrective? If anything in my way of thinking produces hatred, that's prima facie evidence that I'm wrong. Now, not inevitably, I have to check it out. But if I hate, I'm probably aligning myself with the forces of darkness. If I'm condemning an entire group of people to a judgment of mine, not making any difference, meaning everybody of that group is that way, that seems like out of the Gnostic forces of darkness. So I have several correctives in my own mind, in my inner life, my interpersonal life, and the way I see the world, meaning if I end up thinking this way, it might be something unholy and untrue and destructive. All right, so I hope you found this useful to look at yourself, to look at the world, to look at how people think, to look at different ideologies. I hope you see this part as a part of the perennial philosophy. It's worldwide, it's everywhere. Not that it all comes from one fountain, but I think every reflective spiritual person participates in this one way or the other. That next week we'll discuss Neoplatonism. You'll see this even more clearly, that this is a structure of the way that reflective, spiritually oriented people think everywhere, by the way. And then the week after that, we're going to fold all of this into the origins of the Kabbalah. All right, that's the end of my formal presentation.